Claire Myers stood at the center of the research station, staring at the holographic screens displaying the data from the experiment her team had been working on for months. Everything was going perfectly as they approached the final phase of their quantum teleportation project. They had spent years preparing for this moment, but something felt off today. The energy readings were more intense than expected. The rift generator flickered wildly with unstable waves of power. The entire station hummed and vibrated as though it was alive. A faint crackling noise filled the air, and then the room was flooded with an overwhelming blinding light. It was like staring into the sun. She shielded her eyes and shouted for the team to stand back, but it was already too late. The rift burst open in front of them, ripping a hole in the fabric of reality itself. The station's lights flickered, and alarms began blaring throughout the control room. "What have we done?" one of the engineers muttered, his voice trembling as he stared at the swirling blackness that stretched out beyond the rift. The edges of the portal crackled with raw energy, warping the very air around them. It wasn't just an opening into another place. It felt wrong. It felt like something was waiting on the other side. Myers knew that they had to shut it down quickly before the situation escalated beyond control. But as she reached for the emergency shutdown button, the rift seemed to respond to her presence. The light intensified, and for a split second, she thought she saw a shadow moving through the opening, something massive, something unnatural. Her breath caught in her throat. And then it emerged. The creature stepped into view, its form towering and covered in rough armored plates like a living war machine. It was like nothing from this world. Its eyes glowed a deep blood red, and its jagged mouth opened as if to roar. But instead, only a deep growl echoed through the control room. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly, and a wave of dread washed over the team. Its movements were slow but deliberate as it stepped forward with a force that caused the metal beneath its feet to groan and bend. The creature's body shifted unnaturally, in ways that defied logic. It seemed to bend space itself, as if the very rules of physics didn't apply to it. Myers couldn't breathe as she watched the creature grow closer. Its eyes locked onto her, and it seemed to study her with an unsettling curiosity. "Close the rift now," Myers ordered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her team scrambled to comply, but the creature did not allow them the time to finish whatever they were trying to do. It surged forward with terrifying speed and power. Its fist slammed into the nearest console, sending sparks flying and the lights flickering out as it tore through the station's systems. Panic spread through the room as the team scattered for cover. The creature's growl deepened, and it swung its claws across the walls, tearing through the metal like it was paper. Myers tried to focus on the rift controls, but her mind raced in all directions as she realized that they were out of their depth. They had opened a doorway to something far worse than they could have ever imagined. "We need to get out of here," one of the team members yelled, but the door was already blocked by debris. The creature was relentless. It moved with the cold precision of a hunter, and the feeling of impending doom grew heavier with every passing second. Myers backed away from the creature, her heart racing as she stared at the rift still glowing brightly behind it. She didn't know how to stop this, how to undo the damage they had done. All she knew was that they had opened a door to something far worse than anything they could have predicted, and now there was no turning back. The creature continued its rampage, its eyes glowing with an almost malicious intelligence. As it moved through the station's corridors, its massive form made the space seem small as it tore through the walls. Without effort, the hum of the station's emergency alarms was drowned out by the deafening roar that echoed through the halls. The air was thick with panic and confusion as Myers and her team scrambled to figure out what to do next. "We can't just stand here," one of the engineers shouted as he dove behind a console for cover. "We need to find a way to fight back." Myers barely heard him as she stared at the creature's path of destruction. It moved with purpose, as if it knew exactly what it wanted, and it wasn't done yet. The team tried to assess their options, but every plan they came up with was quickly invalidated by the creature's sheer power and ruthlessness. They fired everything they had at it, weapons designed for crowd control and defense against intruders, but it was as if they were throwing pebbles at a mountain. The creature barely flinched. It casually swiped its claws, through the air, sending bursts of energy crashing into the walls as it advanced forward. The team's weapons had no effect against its thick armor, and its resilience seemed limitless. "We have to shut the rift," Dermyers said finally, her voice steady, but her hands shaking with fear. "If we don't close it soon, more of them will come." The team quickly made their way to the control room, but they were met with a new problem as they neared the door. The rift began to pulse and shift, as though something inside was responding to their movements. Another figure emerged from the darkness. It was smaller than the first, but just as terrifying, with sleek armor and limbs that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. It hissed as it emerged, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp teeth. "This isn't just one creature," Dermyers realized, her voice almost breaking. "They're coming through in waves." Panic surged again as the new creature charged the team, forcing them to scatter for cover. Once more it moved with blinding speed, dodging their attacks, as if it could read their every move. One of the scientists tried to make a run for the emergency exit, but was grabbed and lifted off the ground by the creature's long, sharp claws. The team could only watch in horror as the scientist was thrown into a wall with sickening force. Dermyers gritted her teeth and turned back to the rift controls. She knew that closing the rift was their only chance to survive, but she couldn't help but feel the growing dread that they were out of their league. These creatures weren't just invaders, they were predators, and they weren't about to leave without claiming their prize. The station was falling apart as the invaders pushed deeper into the facility. Another creature emerged from the rift, this one even more grotesque than the last. It had a massive head with tentacles hanging from its chin, and its body was a strange hybrid of metal and flesh. It looked as if it had been pieced together from the remains of other creatures. "We need to move," Dermyers shouted, but the path to safety was quickly closing and the invaders were everywhere, and their numbers were growing fast with every new creature that emerged from the rift. As the team continued to retreat deeper into the station, the reality of their situation set in. They were losing the battle, and the rift wasn't just a doorway to another world. It was a conduit for a full-scale invasion, and humanity was completely unprepared. Dermyers glanced back one last time at the rift, and the chaos that had followed in its wake. The team was running out of time and options, but in the back of her mind she couldn't shake the thought that the worst was yet to come. The team had no choice but to keep moving deeper into the station. With every step, the sounds of destruction grew louder behind them. The invaders were methodical in their attack. They didn't rush, they didn't need to. They tore through the station with ease, like hunters cornering their prey, and the humans were running out of places to hide. The team could hear the distant roars of creatures and the sound of metal being shredded as though it were paper. Dermyers pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to maintain some semblance of focus. Their only hope now was to reach the central control room, where they could initiate the emergency shutdown of the rift generator. But the path to it was treacherous. The halls were littered with debris from destroyed walls and terminals. Fires were starting to break out in places. The station was falling apart around them. "We have to get to the core," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We can still stop this, but we need to move fast." But even as she spoke, a loud crash echoed from behind them, and the team froze. The sound of massive footsteps grew louder, and then the creature appeared again. It was one of the larger ones, its glowing red eyes scanning the hallway before it locked onto the team. Its growl reverberated through the walls, and the team immediately scattered to find cover. Dermyers ducked behind a shattered control panel, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. But there was nothing they had left that could stop this creature. No weapons, no tools to defend themselves. The team had fought and retreated as best they could, but it was clear they were outmatched and outgunned by beings that were more powerful than anything humanity had ever faced. "There's too many of them," one of the scientists whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't fight them off. There's no way we can fight them all." Dermyers clenched her jaw as she forced herself to think she had no choice but to believe they could still win. She couldn't give up, not when so many lives depended on her. But as she looked at the team, she could see the fear in their eyes. It was a fear she hadn't seen in them before. This wasn't just an alien threat. It was an extinction-level event, and humanity's chances of survival were growing slimmer by the minute. "We don't have to fight them all," she said finally. We just need to close the rift." The creature roared again and lunged toward them, forcing the team to dive out of the way. Its claws scraped the metal floor, and its powerful body slammed into a nearby support pillar, shaking the whole corridor. The station groaned under the strain, and Myers realized with a sinking feeling that time was running out. "We need to move now," she urged the team as she ran toward the maintenance hatch that led to the core systems. "If we don't get to the control room and activate the shutdown sequence, this whole station will be lost, and so will Earth." The team followed close behind their steps, heavy and uncertain, but the creature was close now, and it wasn't letting up. It continued to chase them, its movements precise and relentless, as if it knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were so close to the hatch, but they couldn't outrun it forever. "Go, go, go," one of the engineers shouted as he ducked into the hatch just as the creature's massive fist smashed into the wall above him, causing debris to rain down into the hallway. The last of the team scrambled into the maintenance tunnel, and Myers slammed the hatch closed behind them. They were safe for now, but they all knew it wouldn't last. The countdown to the rift's closure was starting, and if they couldn't reach the core in time, humanity's fight for survival would be over. The maintenance tunnel was narrow and dimly lit, but it was their only path forward. Myers and the remaining team members moved quickly, though their legs felt like lead, their bodies bruised and battered from their previous encounters with the invaders. The hum of the station's failing systems was constant now, a reminder that they didn't have much time left. The rift was still open somewhere above them, and more creatures were sure to come through at any moment. "We can't keep running forever," one of the engineers said breathlessly as they continued down the corridor. "We need to do something or we're all dead." Myers didn't respond at first. Her mind was too focused on the task at hand. She had to get them to the core system, but even that seemed like a distant hope. The station was falling apart piece by piece, and the rift wasn't going to close itself. The weight of their situation was crushing her, but she refused to let it show. They had a chance, still a small chance, but it was the only one they had. As they neared the central core chamber, she finally spoke. "There's a way to reverse the rift. We can't just shut it down. We need to overload the system and force the rift to collapse on itself." "Overload the system?" one of the scientists asked. "Are you sure that will work?" "It has to," she replied. "We don't have another option. The creatures are too strong. We can't defeat them by force, but we can close the rift and force them back to where they came from." The group fell silent as they reached the control room doors. They were heavily damaged, and the station's power was flickering, but there was no time to waste. Myers grabbed the emergency override panel and hacked into the terminal with shaking hands. As she bypassed the security protocols, the doors slowly opened, and the team rushed inside. "This is it," she said. "Once we activate the core's shutdown sequence, we can reprogram the rift's energy flow and reverse it. We just need to trigger the overload, but we have to be fast. The longer we wait, the more the rift destabilizes." One of the engineers ran to a nearby terminal to begin inputting commands as the rest of the team worked to secure the room. They were too exposed, and they needed every second of preparation they could get. The countdown had already started, and the creatures were closing in fast. Just as they thought they might be able to finish the sequence, a low rumbling shook the room. The walls trembled as something massive approached the control room. Myers turned to see one of the larger invaders standing in the doorway, its glowing red eyes scanning the room before settling on the humans. It let out a shrill shriek and stepped forward, its massive claws scraping against the floor as it entered. "We don't have time for this," Myers shouted as she grabbed the last piece of equipment they needed. "Start the overload sequence now." The team worked quickly, their movements frantic as they tried to complete the final steps. But the creature wasn't going to let them succeed without a fight. It lunged toward them, knocking over consoles and sending sparks flying through the air. The room filled with the sound of destruction. But Myers kept her focus. She knew they had to finish what they started or all would be lost. As the creature advanced, one of the engineers shouted, "We're almost there. We just need a few more seconds." "Hurry," Myers urged, her voice tight with fear and determination. "We're running out of time." The creature roared again and charged, But just as it reached them, the overload sequence was activated. The core began to hum loudly as the rift's energy reversed itself, and the station's systems surged to life one final time. The room shook violently as the core's overload sequence kicked into gear. The hum of the rift generator filled the air louder now, a deep, low thrum, like the heartbeat of the station itself. But there was no time to admire the progress. The creature was already charging again, its claws outstretched, ready to tear through anything in its path. "Hold it off," Dermyers shouted to the team. "We're so close, keep it distracted just a little longer." The creature's growl reverberated through the room as it lunged forward. Its massive body slammed into a row of consoles, sending sparks flying across the floor. One of the engineers barely managed to leap out of the way as a piece of equipment was crushed under the weight of the beast. But the team had no choice. They had to keep working. They had to finish the sequence. Another roar echoed through the room, this time from behind them. Another invader had entered the fray. It was smaller than the first, but faster. Its body covered in sleek black armor that seemed to shimmer as it moved. Its eyes glowed with the same malevolent red light as the others, but it moved with unnatural precision, dodging the team's attempts to keep it back. "We need to finish this now," one of the remaining team members shouted as he dodged another swipe from the creature. "We can't fight them off forever." Dermyers nodded grimly. She knew they had no choice. They had to close the rift before more invaders came through, or they would be overwhelmed completely. She focused on the terminal in front of her, her hands shaking as she input the final commands. Her heart was racing with every passing second, the pressure mounting as she worked to finish the sequence. The first creature was circling them again, its massive form filling the room with each step. It was only a matter of time before it reached them, before it tore through the team and destroyed everything they had worked for. But Dermyers couldn't afford to think about that, not yet. She kept her focus on the task at hand. "We're almost there," she said through gritted teeth. "Just a few more seconds." The creature lunged again, but this time the team was ready. They had set up makeshift barriers in the room using whatever materials they could find, and now they stood behind them with weapons in hand, waiting for the creature's next move. The tension was unbearable, the room filled with the sound of claws scraping against metal and the hiss of the invader's breath as it closed in. Now one of the engineers shouted as he slammed a button on his console, and the room erupted in light. The overload sequence triggered, and the core's energy flared to life. The rift began to pulse erratically. As the energy flow reversed itself, the creatures screamed as the force of the reversal began to pull them back toward the rift. But they weren't going down without a fight. The first creature roared in rage and lunged one final time, smashing through the barriers. The force of its impact sent Dermyers and the others flying across the room, but they were already too late. The energy from the rift surged in one final burst, and the creatures were sucked back through the opening. The room was filled with a blinding light as the rift collapsed on itself. The creatures' screams faded as they were pulled back to whatever hell they had come from, and the station fell silent. Dermyers slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her body aching from the impact. But she was alive. The team had survived. They had done the impossible. They had closed the rift and stopped the invasion. But as the silence of the room settled over them, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The station was eerily quiet now. The silence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on Dermyers and the team as they surveyed the wreckage. The walls were cracked and scorched from the battle. The floor was littered with debris, and the lights flickered weakly above them. As the station struggled to keep power running, their bodies were bruised and battered, but they were alive. They had survived the impossible. "We did it," one of the engineers muttered, his voice hoarse from the tension. "The rift is closed." Dermyers nodded, but her mind was racing. She couldn't let herself believe it was truly over. Not yet. The rift had been closed, but there was something deeply unsettling about what had just happened. The creatures that came through were only a small part of what could have been. They had only seen a glimpse of what lay on the other side, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of it. "We need to check the external cameras," she said as she walked toward the remaining terminals and began typing quickly. "If there's any sign of the rift reopening, we'll need to act fast." The team gathered around as she brought up the live feed from the outside of the station. The screen showed nothing but the cold emptiness of space, the stars twinkling far off in the distance. There was no sign of the rift, no indication that the creatures had returned, but that didn't ease her concerns. "It looks clear," one of the scientists said. "The rift is gone for good." But Myers wasn't convinced. The readings from earlier had been unstable, and the power fluctuations from the rift generator were unlike anything they had ever seen. It had been a doorway to something far worse than they could have imagined, and now that it was closed, she couldn't help but wonder if it had left something behind, something they couldn't see yet. "We can't afford to let our guard down," she said firmly. "We don't know what kind of damage has been done, or if anything's still out there." Her words seemed to hang in the air as the team exchanged uneasy glances. They were exhausted, but she could see the fear still in their eyes. They had witnessed something truly horrifying, and they all knew that the world they had known before the rift was no longer the same. "We need to prepare for the worst," Myers continued, "and that means making sure this station is secure. We need to check for any remaining signs of damage and ensure that the rift doesn't open again. We also need to report back to Earth Command and let them know what happened. We can't keep this to ourselves." The team nodded in agreement, but their expressions were grim. They had seen the power of the creatures that came through the rift. They had felt their fury firsthand, and the thought of facing them again was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. But they couldn't ignore the reality that they had only scratched the surface of something far bigger. As they moved through the station, checking the systems one by one, Myers couldn't help but think back to the moment when the rift first opened. The feeling of dread that had gripped her, the creatures that emerged from it, were only the beginning. They had come from somewhere beyond their understanding, and they were only the first wave of something much larger. "What are we up against?" she whispered to herself as she stared at the empty void outside the station. She didn't have an answer, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they would need to be ready. The team worked through the night, checking every system in the station from life support to power grids, making sure there was no lingering damage from the invasion. Each member of the crew moved like they were on autopilot, their exhaustion visible, but their focus unwavering. Myers was no exception. Her mind was consumed with the things they had just survived, but there was still so much they didn't know. The rift was closed, but the questions it raised weren't going away. "We've checked the main reactors," one of the engineers reported. "Everything's stable for now." Myers nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew that just because the station seemed stable didn't mean they were in the clear. The rift had been a doorway to something much larger, something they still didn't understand. "We need to look deeper," she said, her voice low and strained. "There could be lingering effects from the rift opening. We don't know what kind of influence it had on the station or on us." The team exchanged wary looks, but they knew she was right. They couldn't afford to miss anything. If there was even the slightest chance of danger, they needed to act fast. The creatures they had seen coming through the rift were only a fraction of what might be out there, and Myers had a sinking feeling that they had only glimpsed the tip of the iceberg. "I'll run a full diagnostic on the core," one of the scientists said. "See if there are any energy signatures we missed." Myers gave a small nod as she turned to the main console and began pulling up the data from the station's exterior cameras. She scrolled through footage from the time the rift opened, looking for any signs of strange activity. But all she saw was empty space. The rift was gone. There were no signs of life on the horizon, no indication that anything else had come through. "Nothing unusual on the cameras," she muttered to herself, but she wasn't convinced. The rift's energy was unlike anything they had ever encountered, and its presence had left behind more than just physical damage. There was something about it that didn't sit right with her. As she continued scrolling through the footage, her eyes suddenly froze on a frame. The image was blurry, but unmistakable in the distance, far beyond the station. She could make out a faint ripple in the fabric of space itself. It was subtle, but it was there, a small disturbance that was slowly growing larger. "What is that?" she whispered as she zoomed in on the image. It was hard to tell what it was, but the distortion seemed to be moving toward them. "Myers, what's going on?" one of the engineers asked as he noticed her expression. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. The team gathered around as they all saw the anomaly. The disturbance was growing stronger now. It wasn't just a ripple in space anymore. It was a tear, a small tear that seemed to be opening in the fabric of reality itself. "That's not possible," one of the team members said. "The rift was supposed to close completely. There shouldn't be any residual effects." But there it was, the tear in space, stretching wider with every passing moment. "This is bad," Dermeyer said as the realization set in. The rift might be closed, but something is still trying to come through, and we don't know how to stop it. Panic began to rise in the room as the team watched helplessly. The tear continued to expand slowly at first, but then faster as the pressure of whatever was beyond it pushed harder and harder against the barrier of space itself. "We're not safe," Dermeyer said as she looked at her team. "We need to act now before it gets any worse." The team stood frozen as they watched the tear in space grow wider and wider. It was undeniable now, something was coming through, and it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. The room was filled with the low hum of the station's emergency alarms, the flashing red lights casting an eerie glow across the team's exhausted faces. "This is it," Dermeyer said, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever is coming through is worse than anything we've seen so far. We need to act fast, and we need to make sure we don't give it a chance to break through completely." "How do we stop it?" one of the engineers asked, his voice shaking with fear. "The rift's already closed. We can't open it again, and we can't just fight whatever that is." "We don't have much choice," Dermeyer's replied. "We need to destabilize the area around the tear. We need to cause a collapse in the space around it, force it to close on itself. But that will take too long. We don't have the resources or time." Another scientist added, the fear in their voices rising as the tear grew wider still. "We'll make it work," Dermeyer said with grim determination. "The station's core is our only hope. We have to overload the systems once again and reroute the energy to create an implosion strong enough to close the tear once and for all." They all knew it was a risky move. It might work, it might not, but they had no other option. It was their final chance, and as terrifying as it was, Dermeyer's could see the resolve in the eyes of her team. They had been through hell already, and they weren't about to give up now. "Let's move," she ordered, her voice steady, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. They rushed to the core's control panel as fast as they could, their bodies tired and bruised, but their minds sharp. They had done this before, but now the stakes were higher than ever. They had no idea how much time they had before the tear opened completely, but they couldn't afford to wait any longer. As they worked in a frenzy to initiate the overload sequence, once again the sound of the tear growing louder echoed throughout the station. It was almost like a low rumbling as the pressure on the fabric of space itself continued to build. The team worked in silence, each of them focused on their task, knowing that failure meant certain death. "We're almost there," one of the engineers shouted. "Just a few more seconds." Dermeyers kept her eyes on the monitor. She had to trust her team. They had done the impossible before, and now they had to do it again. But as she watched the tear grow larger and larger, a cold wave of dread washed over her. The energy buildup was becoming too much too quickly, and the core wasn't going to handle it much longer. "Everyone get back," she shouted. "We're triggering the implosion now." With a final push, they activated the core's overload system. The station groaned under the strain as the energy coursed through its systems. The tear in space screamed and began to collapse in on itself. The very fabric of reality seemed to fold inwards as the pressure from the implosion created a powerful shockwave that rippled through the station. The lights flickered and the ground trembled as the tear began to close with a final violent burst of energy. The tear sealed itself, the pressure dissipated, and the room fell silent once again. "Did it work?" one of the engineers asked breathlessly. Dermeyer stood still for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but as she looked at the screen and saw the tear had vanished, she allowed herself to breathe again. "We did it," she said quietly. "The tear is gone, the rift is closed." But as the team exchanged exhausted but relieved looks, Dermeyers couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was still out there watching and waiting. The rift may have closed, but the war was far from over.